She holds a Doctor of Ministry degree in Pastoral Counseling from Hebrew Union College, master's degrees in German from SUNY Albany, and business administration from NYU. Dr. Klaeysen is the ethical humanist religious life advisor at Columbia and a humanist chaplain at NYU. She participates in several interfaith and social justice coalitions and can be seen walking the talk, Central Park West, Fifth Avenue, wherever, at demonstrations and rallies for everything from minimum wage to women's rights to gun control to climate advocacy, immigration issues, and much more. And that's not even why we love her. She's just the best lady in the whole world.
I do like to demonstrate. Just I'm a rabble-rouser. What can I say? Okay, great. On New Year's Day, we had a gathering at our home, close friends, family, for an open house. And I was talking about how a couple of our members had seen If Beale Street Could Talk, and how I wanted to see that movie, but I didn't want to see it alone. And so a couple of women there said, well, we'll see it with you. And so on Friday night, Lisa, who's the mother of my son's best friend, Adam, and Victoria, who's my daughter's best friend from high school, the three of us met and we saw If Beale Street Could Talk. When we left the theater, Lisa said, and people wonder why football players take a knee. I had been crying. Lisa and Victoria were dry-eyed. And that's because they're strong African American women who've lived with that reality all of their lives. I walked Victoria had driven, so we walked her to her car, and then Lisa and I walked to her home. And when we approached the front door, I was reminded of the time when her son Adam was stopped at his front door by quite a number of police. They had pulled up in police cars. They were looking for a young black man who'd stolen a car. Adam had just come home from school, from middle school. He had his books in his arms, and he was incredulous. But I live here. I live here. Do you have any ID on you? No. Here are my school books. It wasn't until one of his neighbors, a white woman, came to the door and said, Adam, what's going on here? That they finally left. Lisa told me that she hadn't given him the talk yet, the talk that her brothers had growing up in Boston. The talk that they had because not only were they stopped, but their house, their home in Boston had been firebombed twice. People threw fruit at her, called her names. Lisa, I said, how can you live without rage all the time? And she said, Anne, that's not living. That's not living. I highly recommend that you see If Beale Street Could Talk. So what I'm going to do today, this morning, is do three things. Why? Because 3 is the magic number, right? The first is to talk about facts on the ground. And for that, you have a handout back there, Facts on the Ground from the NAACP. And I think that you probably know a lot of those facts already. But you know, on Thursdays, I do a Thursday lunch discussion. And this whole month If you can join us, please do. This whole month, the topic is Humanizing Criminal Justice. And so one of the essays that we read was from the New Yorker about the DA there in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner. And after the conversation, the discussion about the articles, one woman said to me, "You know, there was a lot that I didn't know. And I think I'm pretty well read and I'm pretty knowledgeable, but I didn't know this." One thing she didn't know, which comes out in If Beale Street Could Talk, is about 98% of all criminal cases are pled out. They do not see the inside of a courtroom at a trial. And there are estimates of how many of the people that comprise that 98% did not commit that crime. In the movie, it is clear beyond any shadow of a doubt that Alfonso Fani did not commit the rape. There were 2 witnesses. He was on the other side of town. I could go on and on. Absolutely did not commit the crime, but accepts a plea deal because it's the only way that he will ever get out and see his family. So we'll be talking about facts on the ground, because even though I know that you're well read and I know that you're well informed, there may still be some things you're unaware of, and you need to know them. The second thing we'll do is we'll take a look at the First Step Act, and I've got a handout for that too. And that's the bill that really struggled to get through Congress. But it passed, and it was signed. Yes, the person who sits in the White House signed the bill on December 21st, and he may have done so for a very personal reason. And I don't just mean that. I also mean that his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, his father spent time in prison. And because of that personal experience, Jared actually accomplished something. No, he did not solve the crisis in the Middle East. I don't think anyone expected that he was going to do that. But he did make it a very personal issue for him and his family, and did the lobbying necessary on Capitol Hill to see this bill become a law. And then the third thing we'll talk about is, what are the steps that we can take? What can we do in our own communities to make a difference? Let me just state, at the crux of this issue are 2 things. One, throughout our history of dealing with criminal justice, we've always looked at the short-term punitive strategies rather than the long-term social reform. It's just what we do, and we've got to stop doing it. The second thing is that the criminal justice system targets people of color. That's just a fact. It is racist through and through and through to its evil core. Elizabeth Hinton is a Harvard urban historian, and she's the author of the book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime: The Making of Mass Incarceration in America. Now, I know we're all very familiar with Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow, and she's had a seat at Union Theological Seminary this year, and so she's been bringing so much more to the table since that book. What Elizabeth Hinton has done is that she's taken a look at the history and said, this is what's been going on since the 60s and the 70s, and we need to know it, we need to own it, and we need to change it. Here's part of what she says. Consistently And across political and ideological lines, policymakers have been unwilling to disrupt the racial and class hierarchies that have defined the United States historically. The view of Black poverty as the product of Black cultural mythology, the guiding principle of domestic urban policy beginning in the 1960s, limited the war on poverty's possibilities. And throughout the 1970s, even when community-based law enforcement programs and alternatives to formal incarceration proved to not only be cost-effective, but to also respond to the problem of crime far more effectively than the dominant strategies policymakers embraced, nonetheless, officials cut those initiatives short or installed them in rural and suburban communities. They knew what worked, they could prove what worked, but they did something else instead because they're racist. The short-term, knee-jerk reactions always won out over the long-term solutions to social harm that require a lot of patience, a lot of commitment, and a lot of work with real people in real communities. So let's just be aware. Let's start from that point, right? That there's real resistance on the part of elites to truly empower communities to solve their own problems on their own terms. That's what we've been dealing with since the 1960s. Or as Zach Cheney Rice wrote in the New York Magazine, Democrats and Republicans may diverge on several issues, but their zeal for shuffling back Black people in and out of cages has been mutual more often than it has not. So that's the attitude on the ground, right? That's what we're dealing with. Now let's take a look at the facts, and I'm not going to go over all the facts. You've got the handout back there, but just a couple of them can be highlighted. Here are the incarceration trends in America. Between 1980 and 2015, the number of people incarcerated in America increased from roughly 500,000 to 2.2 million. 500,000 in 1980 to 2.2 million in 2015. Today, the United States makes up about 5% of the world's population. And how many of the world's prisoners? The world's prisoners? 21%. Let's take a look at the racial disparities in incarceration. In 2014, African Americans constituted 2.3 million, or 34% of the total 6.8 million correctional population. African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites. Imprisonment rate for African American women, twice the number for white women. Nationwide, African American children represent 32% of children who are arrested, 42% of children who are detained, and 52% of children whose cases are judicially waived to criminal court. If African Americans and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rate as whites, prison and jail populations would decline by almost 40%. And we know that they're not committing any more crimes. Just take a look at drug use and drug abuse. In fact, there are more whites indulging in drug use, than there are blacks. Let's look at the drug sentencing disparities. In 2015, National Survey on Drug Use and Health, about 17 million whites and 4 million African Americans reported using an illicit drug. Okay? However, And they use the same drugs at similar rates. But the imprisonment rate of African Americans for drug charges is almost, guess how many times? 6 times. Statistics show the usage is the same, but the sentencing, 6 times. African Americans represent 12.5% of illicit drug users, but 29% of those arrested and 33% of those incarcerated in state facilities for drug offenses. Now let's take a look at the effects of incarceration. A criminal record can reduce the likelihood of a callback or job offer by nearly 50%. And whether or not you can ask for a background check depends upon the locality that you're in. It's very much a difference. So the negative impact can be twice as large for the African American applicant. Infectious diseases are highly concentrated in corrections facilities. 15% of jail inmates and 22% of prisoners, compared to 5% of the general population, report ever having tuberculosis, hepatitis B, HIV, other STDs. And then let's look at the costs. In 2012 alone, the United States spent over $81 billion on corrections. We could be spending that in our communities, empowering communities to spend that money in the ways that they know it's needed. Spending on prisons and jails has increased at triple the rate of spending on pre-K through 12 public education in the last 30 years. What kind of priorities do we have as a nation? There was a great deal of bipartisan support around the First Step Act. And that's a good thing. But let's make sure that it's going in the right direction. Another thing that Elizabeth Hinton raises, and it was in one of the articles that we discussed on Thursday at the lunch discussion, is that moral component. And that last statistics that I read from the NAACP speaks to that. And that moral component for her is how it's deeply linked to educational access. The greatest deterrent for future incarceration is one's educational level. If you do not have a high school diploma, you have a much higher chance of spending at least part of your life behind bars than somebody who does have an education. We know this. We know this intuitively. We know this in our gut. We know it from our own experience, and statistics bear it out time and time again. So it's important for us to prevail upon policymakers to make sure that that money is put where it needs to go, in early childhood education, in alternatives to detention and incarceration. Okay, those are the facts on the ground, and they're brutal. Let's take a look now, and there's also a handout, on the bipartisan revised First Step Act. And of course, it's an acronym, like all these things are. So the acronym stands for Formerly Incarcerated Re-Enter Society Transformed Safely Transitioning Every Person Act. That's what it stands for. Okay. So it is about re-entry. That's the primary focus of this, is getting folks out of the prisons, into the community, re-entering society. So that's what it's really focused on. And you can read all about it in the handout. It targets federal prisons, which incarcerate more than 180,000 individuals. And that seems like a small number compared to the millions. It is. It would allocate more funding to anti-recidivism programs, make certain offenders eligible for early release, reduce mandatory minimum sentences for some drug crimes, and apply the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 retroactively. Very important, because when it was passed, it was prospective, now it's retroactive. It also bans, under most circumstances, the shackling of pregnant inmates and mandates that individuals could not be incarcerated more than 500 miles away from their immediate families. Here in New York State, people who grew up in the neighborhoods where we say the cradle to prison pipeline, there are certain blocks, certain zip codes in New York City that have a cradle to prison pipeline. They get sent upstate, but I mean way upstate, near the Canadian border. We're talking a 10-hour bus drive. How do you keep a family intact when you take them more than 500 miles away from their family? Now, we do what we can here. I'm looking at Henrika. Thank you so much for the Social Service Board supporting and continuing to support the supervised televisitation programs that keep families intact while people are in jails. And I want to tell you now the distinction. A jail is for someone who hasn't been convicted yet or has a lower level crime that doesn't require a longer period of imprisonment. Prison is when you have been convicted. So we've been active on Rikers Island, keeping families intact. And now, thank goodness, we're going to Bedford Hills, so a prison, which is wonderful. It's a modest proposal, as is this First Step Act. Modest. But it's something. It's something. There are some problems with it. And let me tell you what they are. It has mostly to do with the risk assessment tool that's used for early release. Sherilyn Eiffel, who's president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, really highlighted the difficulty with that risk assessment. And she said, "We have long opposed using risk assessment instruments to determine eligibility for supervised release of prisoners. These tools often produce racially disparate results that cannot be scientifically justified. It's pseudoscience." A couple of months ago, Maggie and I showed TED Talks on the second and fourth Tuesday afternoons. And one of the TED Talks that I showed was on that issue of these assessments. They give the appearance of being objective mathematical algorithms. They are not. And you really, really need to look at them closely. And one of the reasons you can't look at them too closely is because private corporations devise them, and they do not want you looking under the hood. They don't want you to see how they put those algorithms together. Eiffel goes on to say, "We hope that the measures included in this bill to address risk assessments will be sufficient to relieve these concerns, and we will closely monitor the development and use of these instruments by the Bureau of Prisons." Getting back to Elizabeth Hinton, she also has something to say about this risk assessment. She says, "For me, it's the most troubling aspect of the bill. Who determines whether or not someone is a risk to society? Is it going to be the prison authorities? Is it going to be trained counselors and social workers? It's troubling. It's very troubling." And she's not the only one who's concerned about that. Michelle Alexander, right? The new Jim Crow. She also has something to say about the assessment and also about the bail that may come from that. You've heard about the ankle bracelets, right? You get an early release if you get an ankle bracelet. So a lot of that has been going on now too. That will be part of this. Well, here's the problem with that. And as Michelle Alexander says, you know, a good part of the bill is the bail reform, but we're now getting to what she calls e-carceration. E-carceration. What it's going to do, so you'll be free, but you won't be free. So as Michelle Alexander says, even if you're lucky enough to be set free, free is in quotation marks, from a brick and mortar jail thanks to a computer algorithm, an expensive monitoring device likely will be shackled to your ankle. And you know what that is. It's a GPS tracking device provided by a private company. And it ain't free. $300 a month in an involuntary leasing fee. Your permitted zones of movement may make it difficult or impossible to get or to keep a job, to attend school, to care for your family, or to visit family members. You are, as Alexander says, effectively sentenced to an open-air digital prison, one that may not extend beyond your house, your block, or your neighborhood. One false step or one malfunction of the GPS tracking device will bring cops to your front door, your workplace, and wherever they find you, and you will be right back in jail. So the First Step Act is a modest proposal. It's a good first step, but there are problems with it. The risk assessment and the whole business with the ankle, the GPS tracking device. Now, we're talking about 180,000 prisoners, federal. What about the millions of others? Well, the state level efforts really matter more. And there is some good news about that. So only about 8%, or roughly 181,000 people, are in federal custody, and that's what this new law is going to look at. But it will have some effect on the states. Some states are beyond this. They've done far more criminal justice reform. Some states aren't quite up to it. But the passing of this law means that there will at least be some standard where there hadn't been one before. More than 1.9 million state and local inmates are likely to benefit from this. And it's also because of other things that are happening, and that is in the state, local areas, levels. One is the crunched budgets. There isn't any money for this anymore, right? If you're putting everything into the criminal justice system, there's nothing left for education. There's nothing left for the other services that we need. States know that. So the crunched budgets is helping. The shifting public opinion is helping. There's a growing consensus that the old policies have failed. John Pfaff is a law professor at Fordham University who researches criminal sentencing, and he says, we're at a unique moment where politicians, voters, and big donors tend to be in agreement. Big donors is important. I'll get to that in a moment. George Soros. Ashley Nellis is a researcher in the Sentencing Project, which is a Washington, D.C. based advocacy group. And what she says is, many states already match or go beyond what's in the federal law, and legislators in others can now point to federal reform as they push the local criminal justice changes. So it's good. It's really good. Here are some factors that are playing into this good news. One is that fewer crimes are being committed, right? The population has been going down. A second is the legalization of marijuana. Finally. Decriminalize it, legalize it, tax the hell out of it. It's time. It's past time. That has helped a great deal. And then a third factor is district attorneys. Let's get back to the Philadelphia DA, Larry Krasner. Guess who funded his campaign? George Soros. There has been a wave of local prosecutors that have ridden into office in recent years on campaigns promising to reform criminal justice to end mass incarceration. In Boston, Rachel Rollins won the race for Suffolk County DA. Her whole program was incarceration should be reserved for violent offenders. And she lists the 15 crimes that her office would not prosecute. In Bexar County, Texas, which includes San Antonio, Democratic Joe Gonzalez won the race on DA on a platform that included reforming the bail system. And then, of course, we get to Larry Krasner, who is highlighted in the New Yorker, and who was sworn into office by his wife, who's a judge. Isn't that wonderful? The push to overhaul prosecutors' offices was pioneered by billionaire George Soros. So he really has done some of the things they accuse him of, and thank goodness for it. So in his office is Whitney Timas, and she heads Soros's prosecutor initiative. And this is separate from his philanthropic work. She says the effort aims to achieve a single overarching goal. We want to end mass incarceration. That's our North Star. We've won twice as many races as we've lost. We're not going to win them all, but we're trying to, because that's the difference between people unjustly sitting in jail or not. Good news. It's good news. When Larry Krasner brought in a new group of assistant district attorneys, and in Philadelphia they call them the baby ADAs, they start an 8-week training period. And this is what he says to them. Who here has read Michelle Alexander, referring to the new Jim Crow? Well, even if you haven't read it, open the flyleaf. Look at the stats. There are more people of color in jail, in prison, on probation and parole than there were in slavery at the beginning of the Civil War. He reminds the trainees that they represent the Commonwealth. That means you represent people who are not victims of crime, people who are not defendants. You represent kids who are going to public school and they have too many kids in the class. You represent, because you are stewards of an enormous amount of social resources, what their lives can be in 10 or 15 years if resources are used in those schools. Right? That's what the Philadelphia DA is saying to the baby ADAs. Right? We need to free up these resources for where it matters. So where do we go from here? Right? That's the third part. I'm winding down. Where do we go from here, and how do we support these efforts? There are a couple books that have come out recently. One of them is called Called to Rise, A Life in Faithful Service to the Community That Made Me, and it's by David O. Brown. He's a former police chief in Dallas. And he came up through the ranks. And he had a certain mindset about what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to get the bad guys. You're supposed to arrest them. You're supposed to throw them in jail and keep them there. But in the police department, he learned other things too, and he learned how racist it was. He himself is an African American. He said, we will make progress only when we set aside our assumptions and really start listening to each other. So when he became police chief, he instituted police community engagement, and it led to a historical decline in Dallas's crime rate. Police community engagement works. It works. It takes more training, it takes more patience, it may even take more resources, but it works. Paul Butler wrote a book called Chokehold, Policing Black Men. And he writes, cops routinely hurt and humiliate black people because that is what they are paid to do. The police, as policy, treat African Americans with contempt. And he says we are following this wretched cycle, which Elizabeth Hinton refers to since the 60s. He says, in order to halt this wretched cycle, we must not think of reform, we must think of transformation. The United States of America must be disrupted and made anew. Not reform, not modest proposals, not short-term ineffective strategies, transformation, disruption, making America anew. He cites a study, and again, there are studies for all this, folks. This is not airy-fairy. It's grounded in statistics, in facts. He cites NYU's Brennan Center for Justice, which estimated that 40% of the nation's prisoners could be released without compromising public safety. And this would save taxpayers $200 billion over the next 20 years, free up new opportunities for resources and outcomes. It could create jobs for low-income citizens who have no options for survival outside of the informal economy. Butler thinks it's wise to reallocate funding from police departments and correction authorities to community health care and education, and I couldn't agree more. I can only say amen. Finally, Angela Davis edited a collection of essays called Policing the Black Man, Arrest, Prosecution, and Imprisonment. And in this, Elizabeth Hinton, whom I've fallen in love with, I've referred to her a lot, she has an essay, and she says that these programs, some of the programs in the police departments are known as procedural justice. Policemen are taught to treat people with dignity, respect, and fairness. They build trust and legitimacy. We've also heard about implicit bias training. And Yale Law School's Tracy Maris and Tim Tyler put in their essay, the more trust communities have in the police, the more likely they are to report crime, provide testimony, and help to hold offenders accountable. Brian Stevenson, we've all heard of him. He's the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, who's dedicated his career to criminal justice. His take on it is that we need to have reconciliation hearings. Let's learn from South Africa. Let's have truth and reconciliation hearings. Past abuses must be repaired so that safety and justice can exist for us all. There's so much more that can be said about this, and I hope that this conversation will continue here. I hope you'll come back this afternoon. The Fortune Society, David Rothenberg, who founded the Fortune Society, will be presenting his play on the castle. I'm going to give the last words to Tish. Tish is the narrator of If Beale Street Could Speak. And she starts it off this way, and she narrates the movie, and it's just beautiful. I look at myself in the mirror. I know that I was christened Clementine, and so it would make sense if people called me Clem, or even, come to think of it, Clementine, since that's my name. And it doesn't make sense for people to call me Tish. But I guess it does. I'm tired, and I'm beginning to think that maybe everything happens that happens make sense. Like, if it didn't make sense, how could it happen? But that's really a terrible thought. It can only come out of trouble that doesn't make sense. Today I went to see Fonny. That's not his name either. He was christened Alonzo, and it might make sense if people called him Lonnie, but no, we've always called him Fonny. Alonzo Hunt, that's his name. I've known him all my life, and I hope I'll always know him. But I only call him Alonzo when I have to break some real heavy shit to him. Today I said, Alonzo. And he looked at me, that quickening look of his when I call him by his name. He's in jail. That's where we were. I was sitting on a bench in front of a board, and he was sitting on a bench in front of a board. And we were facing each other through a wall of glass between us. You can't hear anything through this glass, and so you both have a little telephone. You have to talk through that. I don't know why people always look down when they talk through a telephone, but they always do. You have to remember to look up at the person you're talking to. I always remember now, because he's in jail, and I love his eyes. And every time I see him, I'm afraid I'll never see him again. So I pick up the phone as soon as I get there and just hold it, and I keep looking at him. So when I said Alonzo, he looked down, and then he looked up, and he smiled, and he held the phone and he waited. I hope that nobody has to look at anybody they love through glass.